Years ago, before my husband and I were married, we went on a weekend camping trip with a bunch of friends to the oldest town in our country. The first night, we all got really drunk and nothing particularly interesting happened, apart from maybe being told to shut up by the campground owner. We thought that was the scariest part of our trip. But the next day, we had a frightening experience. We did a full day of sightseeing, caught a ferry to another town and had lunch, did a lot of walking and went to a museum. We were all exhausted by the time we got back and had eaten dinner. That night, we went to our tents and fell asleep quickly. But in the middle of the night, I was awoken by a rustling in the bushes behind our tent. I tried to ignore it, but it happened again, and this time it woke my husband. We both listened in silence, as we heard nothing but the occasional cricket. But then, suddenly, we heard this awful rasping breathing that was incredibly loud. I immediately thought it was a person hanging out in the bushes outside of our tent. My heart was pounding as my husband and I quietly unzipped the tent and tiptoed around the side where the bushes were. Right at that moment, whatever it was made the most horrific snorting sound, and I couldn't help but jump and let out a scream. My husband switched on the flashlight, and right there, about 2 feet away from our tent, was the most freaking enormous hedgehog I have ever seen. Although it wasn't a person in the bushes, I was still scared out of my mind. The adrenaline was pumping through my veins as I couldn't believe what I was seeing. We both laughed in relief, but the memory of that night stuck with us for a long time. As I walked through the dense forest, I couldn't help but feel a sense of adventure and excitement. The rustling of leaves and chirping of birds filled the air around us, making it feel like we were the only ones around for miles. I was with a friend, and we were exploring the wilderness on a camping trip, learning how to survive in the great outdoors. As we walked, we stumbled upon an abandoned hunter cabin. The cabin was old, with boarded-up windows and a thick metal panel blocking the door. The bolts that held it shut were heavy-duty. Clearly, they didn't want anyone to get in or out. However, we couldn't resist the temptation to investigate, so we knocked on the door. Suddenly, we heard a low grunting sound and heavy footsteps from inside the cabin. Fear shot through me like lightning, and I froze in place for a moment. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be inside. Was it an angry bear, or perhaps a crazed hunter? Without thinking twice, my fellow camper and I bolted back to the campsite as fast as we could. The adrenaline pumping through our veins made us run faster than we ever had before. The sound of our footsteps pounding the forest floor echoed through the trees as we ran for our lives. We finally made it back to the campsite, our hearts pounding in our chests. We quickly told the other campers what had happened, but no one believed us. We were left with a lingering sense of fear and uncertainty, wondering what could be inside that cabin and what kind of danger could be lurking in the woods. As we lay in our tents that night, we couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every hustle in the bushes, every snap of a twig made our hearts race with fear. We never did find out what was inside that cabin, and honestly, I'm not sure if I wanted to. It was supposed to be a peaceful camping trip with my family, but things quickly took a dark turn. We had just settled into our tents when the couple next to us arrived with a boombox blaring heavy metal music. I politely asked them to move the music to the other side of the campsite, and they agreed, but that was just the beginning. As the sun began to set, the couple's visitors arrived in a rundown Camaro. They were passing around a bottle and talking, and I could hear their words through the thin tent walls. That's when I heard the first man's chilling words. "Look at those witch assholes there. That fucker asked me to turn off the music. I have a gun in the glove compartment and they may not make it through the night." My heart raced and I realized the danger we were in. I knew I had to do something. In the darkness, I rode one of my kids' tiny bikes up to the camp's host campsite to tell him about the situation. But with no cell phones, we had to wait for him to call the sheriff. I hurried back to our tent, where my family was still sleeping, and began to quietly rouse them. But before we could even pack up our gear, the sheriff arrived. We stayed in our tents, trembling in fear, until he talked to the campers next door and ordered them to leave. It wasn't until the next day that we learned just how close we had come to a tragedy. The visitor had a warrant out for his arrest, and the other man was a felon in possession of a firearm, and we were lucky to have escaped unharmed. As I look back on that night, my heart still races with adrenaline and fear. It was a terrifying experience, but one that reminds me to always trust my instincts and be prepared for the unexpected.